Hey guys, how's it going? So I want to continue my deep dive series into the Beatles American Capitol albums. We're on episode number 2, so that means we must be up to the Beatles' second album. Now this just really meant that it was the Beatles' second album for Capitol. Technically, if you're keeping score, it was the third album on an American label. You had the VJ introducing the Beatles, Meet the Beatles, and then introducing, the Beatles' second album. So I'm going to show what copies of this album I have. I'm not going to show the cassette or CDs. It just gets to be a little bit redundant. But this is the mono copy of Beatles' second album on the Rainbow label. This is a stereo copy also on the Rainbow label. Another stereo. And the interesting thing is that these labels have different styles on each of them. The stereo font is different. The font which lists the Beatles by name. It's interesting that they spell out each of the members of the Beatles' names on these labels, but you can tell which part of the country the pressing came from, whether it was the Jacksonville plant or they had a plant in Scranton. You can tell by the design of the label. If you're interested, that's why there might be multiple variations of the Capitol Rainbow label, just kind of FYI. This is a copy. It's an early pressing, and it's still in the shrink. Somebody tore off the price sticker here. Shame on them. But as you can see, that label looks different from the one that I just showed you, even though it's an early 60s pressing. And then this is it's actually a promo copy that I have right there. This is on the purple Capitol label, which means it's from the late 1970s. And then interestingly, in Canada, they released this album with a different track listing and a slightly different modified name. They call it Long Tall Sally in Canada. Cover looks pretty much the same, although you don't have the She Loves You and Roll Over Beethoven on here. And also the track listing for this album is on side 1, I Want to Hold Your Hand. I Saw Her Standing There. No, it's not Meet the Beatles. You Really Got to Hold on Me, Devil in Her Heart, Roll Over Beethoven, and then Misery, which is from the first album. On side 2, you have Long Tall Sally, I Call Your Name, Please Mr. Postman, This Boy, I'll Get You, and You Can't Do That. So that is more in line with the regular track listing on here. So Capitol had released Meet the Beatles in February of 1964. This came out on April 10th, 1964. So less than 2 months later, they already had this one in the shops. And Capitol had a number of leftover tracks from the With the Beatles album at their disposal, and they also had some of the earlier singles to draw from, because in the UK, as you probably know if you're a Beatles fan, the Beatles had a policy of not putting their singles, the A or the B side, on their long playing albums, and Capitol had no problem at all doing that. And also Capitol really had the freedom at that point because the Beatles were not well known. They were not popular. They did not have the leverage to be able to tell the American record company, you're not going to mess with our albums. We want the track listing to say the same. They didn't have any of that power yet. Late 1965, early 1966, they would start to exert some of that influence over the record company. Like, you're not changing the cover to Rubber Soul. And you're not going to mess with, you're not going to be putting A and B sides. You're not going to put Paperback Ready. You're not going to put Rain on Revolver. So at that point, they had more power, being that they were the most popular group in the world, to dictate to Capitol what they could and couldn't do. But at this point in their career, they really had no control. So Capitol put this out without consulting the Beatles at all, developed this artwork, and basically took what tracks they had available to compile a second album for the American market. So you have Roll Over Beethoven, which was off With the Beatles. You have Thank You Girl, which was the B-side of a single. I think it was From Me to You, if I'm not mistaken. You Really Got a Hold of Me, which was from With the Beatles, Devil in Our Heart, and Money, which were both from Meet the Beatles. And then, interestingly, George Martin gave them the permission to have the B-side of the forthcoming single, Can't Buy Me Love, which of course was in advance of the Hard Day's Night soundtrack. So that's why you have You Can't Do That, which was originally, like I say, the B-side of Can't Buy Me Love. But George Martin gave them that track and let them stick it here on Beatles' second album so that they could have essentially 11 songs to make up an album. Because in the UK, it was standard to have 14 tracks on an album. In America, they were more accustomed to having 12 or 11 songs, and so that's pretty much what you got right here. On the B side, you got Long Tall Sally, which was a leftover from an EP, which is called Long Tall Sally. Same with I Call Your Name. Please Mr. Postman, of course, was on with the Beatles. And then you've got the single She Loves You and I'll Get You. Artwork was a lot of photographs that had been taken during the first tour of America in early 1964. And Capitol was very proud of their artwork. As a matter of fact, in the mid-60s, when the Beatles were pushing back on Capitol changing the artwork on some of their albums, Capitol said, look, we feel like our artwork is better than anything that they released in the UK. Ooh, that's some hubris. But nonetheless, yeah, it's a fine album. I know people that like this better than Meet the Beatles. Personally, I do like Meet the Beatles better. I think the cover versions on here aren't as great, aren't as solid, but you got the reverb, heavy reverb on some of these tracks. Most notably, You Can't Do That and I Call Your Name, and She Loves You got heavy reverb, which Capitol used, I think, to expand the stereo sound on those records. But nonetheless, great album, one of my favorites on their early catalog, and yeah. That is it. So next time we'll be doing something new. Hope you're doing well. Take care.